Please be seated. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dames and herren. This afternoon, we will be listening to Professor Lu Feis and listening to his valedictory lecture as his family, friends, colleagues, and students. Before this lecture, we are gathering here for the Symposium Aesthetics by Algorithm, by 4 distinguished speakers: Professor Stefan Wensven, Professor Jacques van Wijk, mevrouw Maria Tutus, and Professor Troy Nachterhal. This symposium brings together 2 themes that Professor Lu Feis is passionate about and that he strives to integrate. The integration is very relevant for today's discipline of industrial design. Data, AI, algorithms, generative design, and system thinking are becoming core elements. Aesthetics and these core elements come together and inform each other. Today, let's start with the aesthetics of artificial intelligence. Let's invite Professor Stefan Wensven. Stefan Wensven is a full professor of constructive design research in smart products, services, and systems from Department of Industrial Design here at TUE. Professor Stefan Wensven. I will set up a slide for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jun, for this introduction, and thank you, Lu Feis, for this opportunity to tell a bit of my story. It's the second time I'm presenting this story, and I had to cut it down from 45 to half hour, and now it's 20 minutes, so I might be speeding up at a certain point. I hope you bear with me. This is my special tribute to Lu Feis shirt, and it also features as a background. On Aesthetics of Intelligence. Next slide. Oh, I don't see it here. Yes. So the structure of this lecture, it's a bit of my personal account of my relationship to aesthetics. I'm talking about the past 3 waves of design aesthetics. I will talk about the S word, and I will talk about the 4th wave, or at least towards an aesthetics of intelligence. When I talk about aesthetics in relationship to design, I see it as a critical reflection of how people create and design, but also how they use, enjoy, or dislike design. And in my belief, aesthetics is fundamental to understand how design technology affect people's emotion, their understanding of the world, and also their attitude towards life. So this is my image of my Facebook when Facebook didn't exist as part of industrial design, because I studied industrial design engineering in Delft almost 31 years ago. And at that point, my teachers were telling me that good design is aesthetic. This is Brown, I think, very well known for having good aesthetic quality, where it's integral to its usefulness, so combining beauty and functionality. and well-executed objects can be beautiful. So this is Dieter Rams, and he has 10 principles, and this is principle 5, good design is unobtrusive, in order to leave room for the user's self-expression. Perhaps his most famous one, less is more, where good design is as little design as possible. So this was in my first year, my second year, what my teachers were telling me. And then went on the study trip of the Study Association to Groningen and just tagged along. And there I went to the Groningen Museum to Memphis, an exhibition where we saw these type of examples, or lights like these. And I was, well, having an aesthetic experience. I must say I was completely overwhelmed by the wildness of the colors, the wild combination of shapes, the total disrespect for good design. And I thought like, wow, are they allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do this? And this somehow resonated with me because I was a skateboarder, trying to be a surfer, so more counterculture, maybe disrespectful to authority. Being a lover of physical magazines, where they had a total disrespect for proper graphic design, the work of David Carson, for example. So this appealed to my personal values for aesthetics. So inspiration from countercultures, challenging the status quo, bodily and emotional expression, and values of freedom, dynamics, contrast, yet also inviting. So this was my, I think, second design assignment. We had to design a video text terminal, and taking my inspiration from Memphis, close down when it's not in use, and when it's used, it was opening up. So in a way, that started long before in the first waves of industrial design and aesthetics, it was an aesthetics of appearance, where the emerging technologies were new materials like metal and glass, but later on also plastics, and formal qualities of shape, color, proportion, and texture, and disciplines of product design and industrial design. And social cultural qualities were simplicity or in functionality, efficiency, economics, so form follows function, or form follows emotion. So this is in a way the first way. Oh. Yep, that was the... I should be less enthusiastic when I'm touching my keyboard. So form follows function, or form follows emotion. So this was my bachelor and master education, my ingenieurs diploma. And then I moved to, started my PhD, first in Delft, and then was invited by Lou Vijs to join the Department of Industrial Design here in Eindhoven, so 20 years ago. At that point, we were somewhat fed up with the way that they treated interaction design, putting screens on physical products. And we wrote a pamphlet where we don't think products, think experiences. Don't think beauty in appearance, but beauty in interaction. And don't think ease of use, but think enjoyment of the experience. Coming up with different examples where we critique on the status quo and in a way attacking the cognitive approach and vouching for a more embodied approach. So this was my own work. I was a long time known as the alarm clock guy, trying to, instead of putting sensors on people's body, trying to see how we can express ourselves in the way we interact with things. So is it possible when we offer freedom of interaction that there's also freedom of expression? So this is related to my values of freedom of interaction, bodily expression, emotional expression, and dynamic action. And what we demonstrated in an example that there was a relationship between how people felt and how they interacted with their device. Of course, a presentation for Lou Vijs needs to have a formula, so this is my formula, where we try to have regression equations to model the emotional mood out of action and pattern parameters. At that point, we were not the only ones who were talking about the change of aesthetics. Tony Dunn was talking about an aesthetics of use. In Sweden, they were talking about aesthetics of computational artifacts, and saying also aesthetics as the proper foundation for technology design. It's good to see Philip sitting there. We continue this work on aesthetics of interaction and moving more towards values and tying values, ethics, and aesthetics together, because both deal with values. More specifically influenced by pragmatist aesthetics, trying to find this relation between ethics and aesthetics. So this is the second wave, aesthetics of interaction. Digital media, computation, interactivity, and a different set of formal qualities, temporality, physicality, input, output. And there also are the social, cultural qualities, more modern values, functionality, cognition, usability, or more postmodern, emotional, ethical self-expression. So 10 years ago, maybe a smaller third wave of aesthetics came up, aesthetics of transformation, where disciplines of critical design, service design, social design, and design activism. Talking about disruptive aesthetics, to open up the relation between people's behavior and emotion and related to art activism, for example. So examples of beautiful strangeness in order to demonstrate with design, with a not common aesthetic of beautiful products, but a strangeness that shows us social issues through design and aesthetics. And Thomas Markussen is talking about aesthetic acts, which reorient perception and action. Ilpokoski had the same notion. When the attention of design shifts to social forces, aesthetic concepts tied to products lose a good deal of their relevance. And he talks about different strategies for more social design. About provoking change and creating communities of discussion and discourse. More convivial aesthetics, bringing communities together. A more conceptual aesthetic, where aesthetics is more a found object, trying to capture the local vernacular. So what else happened since then? And in a way, not that much. I mean, we have many beautiful products, and in a way, the entire world is being designed. But the development in research in aesthetics came to a halt in a way, which was now called the S word. So we didn't talk about aesthetics, because aesthetics in a way was unpopular. And in design, it became a neglected area of research, where creativity and innovation are far more popular, because they bring more money into it. And while design thinking gained influence in innovation management, it repressed the role of aesthetic judgment. And I think within design thinking, you never hear the S word, or never people talk about aesthetics and the differences of what people want out of design. Aesthetics is also unpopular, I think, with the designers themselves. I think already when I started studying, it was the dreaded S word of styling. In a way, it seemed that aesthetics is about a superficial layer to package some underlying technology. I think also we should be honest and say that the role of aesthetics is problematic, and it has been used extensively to persuade consumers to buy commodities. And the famous designer Dieter Rams, I think also recently said that he somehow regretted his influence on this consumeristic behavior. In a way, aesthetics is also highly subjective and exclusive. Who decides what is beautiful? It's also hard to measure and therefore hard to research. And some say, well, it was claimed by the domain of philosophy and cultural theory and therefore was taken away from designers. I think we should also be honest that other design aspects are more important. Sustainability and inclusivity are far more urgent topics. And I think designers need to have so many competences on top of all the things we already need to do, that somehow the development of aesthetics fell behind. But I don't think it's irrelevant. I mean, this is the State of the Union, European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, who also says we need to give our systemic change its own distinct aesthetic to match style with sustainability. Aesthetics is also not irrelevant in relation to ethics, as they both deal with values. And it's also not irrelevant in relation to the emerging technologies. So my aim is to redevelop the competence of aesthetics, which brings us to the now, and I would like to position and paddle for this fourth wave, aesthetics of intelligence. Taking a broad definition of artificial intelligence, and what I think we'll see, or we're already seeing, is smart products with a product aesthetics. Or with a UX aesthetics, and maybe some social aesthetics of how to create these services. But I think there's an underlying fundamental layer of aesthetics that we should develop. So some examples, how we move from appearance to interaction to intelligence. It's the prize-winning project of Anke Oosterhout. So when we look at the aesthetics, we can see it as a product with a detailed execution and craftsmanship. We can also look at the interaction, the beauty of the shape change and the haptic force feedback. But I think what's more interesting is the intelligence behind it and how that it has a certain beauty. How there's a balance between human agency and system control. And there are new ways of engaging with the world of energy control. And beyond screen-based interaction. Here's another example, Felix Ross. So again, we can look at the interaction, the beautiful interplay between human and the machine, or the haptic dialogue to exchange intentions. But on the intelligence, it becomes a discussion piece for how we want to engage with smart entities, but also like the autonomous vehicle, but also the cultural aspects of driving intelligent cars. Talking about the cultural aspects of aesthetics, this project of Bart Bolluit, looking at theories of Hofstede and different parameters and differences of cultural communities, and designing an intelligent agent with these specific parameters of uncertainty avoidance, so having the same device, yet different interactions, in a way different intelligence, trying to capture it in the video. In order to see whether people perceive these differences and whether they perceive them as culturally different. So on the different aspects,
Come on.
masculine
Keep pushing
cultures or
it.
feminine cultures,
Only
competition versus
250
caring.
meters to go. Give it all you've got. That's it. Great. Now take a 5-minute break.
and one on power distance.
Come on. Keep pushing
Hey,
it.
good afternoon, sir.
Only 250
I would
meters
like a
to
cup of
go.
coffee. Of course. What would you
Give it
like?
all you've
Perhaps-
got.
Okay. A mocha.
Then doing a little test and demonstrating that people actually perceive these cultural differences within the interaction with such an intelligent agent. I think there's also a role for aesthetics on being reflective, provide a critical perspective. The work of Luc Noothout, and as a critique to how intelligence is currently being used by big companies that want our data and thinking, can it not be a bit more democratic? Coming up with 3 or actually 4 different designs and showing them during Dutch Design Week and engaging the larger general audience of what AI could be for them and what the strengths but also what the weaknesses and difficulties of AI are. Because in a way, we can look at a history of beauty, but then I think we all know the examples when we talk about intelligence, which has a certain ugliness, a loss of privacy, exclusion, or commercial exploitation. So in this 4th wave of aesthetics of intelligence, we see the emerging technology of machine learning, generative networks, and the formal qualities, agency, emergence, intentionality, uncertainty, and how can we design for those, and with which values. So is there an aesthetics of uncertainty, which was the work of Alex de Kruijf, recent master student, who looked more at ludic intelligence.
Data is generated all around us, hidden in the background, captured by the digital world. We try to analyze it, control it, in order to make it fit with our intentions and lifestyles. But what if there were others with their own intentions and unique views on data? The light catcher tries to look for the brightest point in the environment, actively trying to catch as much light as possible. The temperature feeler is a bit more passive, simply following along with the temperature. The data collectors provide contextual data for the interpreter. The interpreter is an intelligent lamp that picks a moment and a color using a machine learning algorithm. The interpreter is semi-supervised. It learns from the preferences of the user, but it also learns from its own predictions. Because the predictions will not always be accurate, it leaves an element of uncertainty. Inspired by animistic and ludic design, this project explores an approach to use uncertainty as a material for the design of aesthetics of intelligence in the home, placing an emphasis on exploration and experimentation.
So looking more at everyday aesthetics and exploring an aesthetics of uncertainty, and challenging the centrality of user optimization and looking at animism instead of anthropomorphism. What intelligence, artificial intelligence, but also human intelligence and natural intelligence brings in is that whose aesthetic values are we talking about? Are these designers' intended values or the user's intended values? Or actually what happens when it's being deployed? Or are these institutional values, corporate, legal, or the values of the artificial agent? So I think this brings a new challenge and complexity to designing aesthetics when all these values somehow need to coexist next to each other. And I think an aesthetic approach to that, of balancing, finding harmony in how these different values relate to each other, I think is necessary. These non-human agents can also come from plants and animals and soil, water. And this was the project more on post-human design of the students you see here that were part of a course exploring a post-human design approach to aesthetics of intelligence.
As we enter the Anthropocene, the proposed geological epoch in which we find ourselves now, we see that there is no place on Earth that remains untouched by humans. Our human-centric beliefs, from the fantasy that we can control the planet, to the notion that we are above other things, such as animals, plants, and machines, compels a vision of the world that includes the so-called end of nature. The natural, the notion of nature created by humans, and the artificial, have merged at every scale, creating so-called nature cultures. One perfect example of such a nature culture is the environment of Eindhoven. We will have a brief look at a very ordinary ecology in Eindhoven. This ecology, among other things, consists of actors such as the pigeon, a generative adversarial model, and humankind. These actors are closely interrelated and co-shape each other's behavior. So, let's briefly speculate and try to understand if and how these interrelations are shaped. This GAN entity randomly generates bird-like sounds. It is co-shaped by a human entity and it specifically aims to explore relations between itself and pigeons. This pigeon entity is still quite far away from the GAN. The human entity is trying to establish a relation between the pigeon, himself, and the GAN, by putting small breadcrumbs on the soft moss. Perhaps he thinks this will lure the pigeon out of its nest. The GAN seems to be okay with this behavior. Although we might not be sure, the pigeon seems not to care. Rather than coming over to check out the GAN, or the breadcrumbs, it seems that it prefers to stay on its place. Oh dear. The human entity is triggered again. It has spotted a pigeon entity sitting on the GAN from outside of its window, and checks if the GAN is still working. It ultimately decides to hide the GAN from the possible rain, hoping for a better tryout tomorrow. As you perhaps have seen, a post-human context relies on the assumption that everything is interrelated. Every non-human has been shaped by humans, every human has been shaped by non-humans, and non-humans shape each other. In this process, all actors have equal agency. Whether relationships between actors is intentionally or unintentionally, it might be that we, humans, will never understand the relationships that involve non-human actors. It also might be that no explicit relationship between non-human actors will ever establish, or only establish over a longer period of time. The latter might be applied to context of the pigeon and a GAN. Yet, we cannot be sure about that. In a post-human context, the challenge lies in our human limitations of conceptualizing the relationship that non-human actors, such as a pigeon and a GAN, might have. Ultimately, it is human-centric thinking that drives our desire to fully understand the world as what it is.
So the first time I saw this video in the final presentation for the course, it gave me an aesthetic experience. Not as an immediate pleasure of beauty. I mean, it seemed unsuccessful in attracting birds. I would have never used the plastic jumbo bag to care for the device. But the video was about caring for different relationships between humans, birds, and the generative adversarial model. So for me, it wasn't about beauty. Maybe the personal experience was more about sublimity, a feeling of being overwhelmed by something immensely large that I could not understand. In a way, it was also violating with my values, but I also see that there's something huge behind this work that we at the moment cannot understand, but I think we should try to understand a bit more. This brings us to the now and to you, I think, looking also to our students. So for me, main lessons from this talk: explore your personal aesthetic values, your inspiration and your influences. Right, and respect the 4 waves of aesthetics in design of appearance, interaction, social, and intelligence. I think we need to reappreciate, but also reorient aesthetics for the future development of design as well. And suggesting to develop a design competence in aesthetics of intelligence. Talking about inspirations and influences, today is also 10 years ago that my influence, my inspiration, Professor Kees Overbeke, passed away. I want to shortly remember this, and then I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the inspiring talk about the 4th wave of aesthetics of design. We have time to allow 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Any questions? Yes? What do you think about the 5th wave?
That will be another 10 or 20 years. Maybe I will be giving my final lecture to this audience. At the moment, I don't know yet. I think we first need to pass this one and gain a better understanding, at least in this university where we're so much about technology, what this new technology means for aesthetics. And I will think about it, what the 5th wave will be.
So I know your topic of your valedictory
yes, yeah,
lectures,
maybe
5th wave.
When I retire, I will talk about this 5th wave of intelligence,
Okay.
of aesthetics, sorry.
1 more question? Well, that question was about future, the 5th wave, but I'm more interested in the 1st and 2nd wave. When we started the faculty 20 years ago,
Yes.
we were talking about ambient intelligence. Ambient intelligence means that the intelligence would disappear in the background, and in the foreground we have interface, 1st wave,
Yeah.
and the interaction left, the 2nd wave. So in your talk, you didn't mention this big movement of ambient intelligence.
I think when I was doing my PhD research, so early 2000s, we were starting that 2nd wave. We were talking about aesthetics of interaction and moving towards that part. And I think at that point, intelligence came up. Well, I don't think we had some ways of giving it form and shape. And I think now we have a better understanding of it, but I think we're still developing that, and we need to develop that further.
Look at your example of this thermostat. It is the interface and interaction in the front, and the intelligence disappearing in the background. Is it still ambient intelligence that we are doing? What makes it now, that product or system, the 4th wave?
I think the intelligence is in the background, but I think we want it to become in the foreground. And we want it to have form and be meaningful to who we are and to our bodies, to different cultures. So I think this intelligence should actually move to the foreground and get its own form and shape. And that's needed by its physicality, the appearance, the interaction. But I think now we're looking at how we can give shape to this intelligence, talking about transparency of intelligence, or
explainable
maybe
AI.
It's explainable AI, or UX for AI. I think these are all things where the values of intelligence and the way we can get meaning out of it should be moved to the foreground.
So we need to move the intelligence from the background to the foreground.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Stefan Wensman. Let me first do the technique switch. Now I have the slides set. So then we are going to have the honor to invite the second speaker, Professor Jacques van Wijk. Professor Jacques van Wijk is a full professor in visualization at Department of Mathematics and Computer Science at our university. Professor Jacques van Wijk.
Thank you, Hyun. 1 second. Thanks for the invitation to give a presentation at this seminar. Well, I thought it would be a good start to compare Lou's career with my career. There's some interesting aspects here. Lou started hardcore electrical engineering, moved to very technical computer science, embedded systems, formal methods, and that kind of stuff. And then he moved to industrial design. Yeah? Okay, my route is I started by studying industrial design. Then I moved in the direction of computer science during my PhD. And in the end, I ended up in computer science. Now, it's interesting. You see some crossing points here. And indeed, for about 3 years, we were colleagues at the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. Well, he was somewhat, from my perspective, in the one extreme with all those formal methods and so on. While I was more considered as some artist or whatever. Well, this is a very important next meeting. In 2013, I attended the Bridges Conference, a fascinating conference where mathematics tries to bridge with art and design. And then I saw the real Lou. It seems like that was his natural habitat. I saw all the fascinating work he did in fashion, and it was all very impressive. And today we are here. I was very happy to be invited, and I was definitely very much intrigued by the title, Aesthetics by Algorithm. Yeah, I'm a real amateur in aesthetics. Also not a real expert in algorithm, but yeah, in my work they play some role, so it was nice to reflect on that and start to ask myself some questions. Okay, first I'll tell you something about my background. You'll see it overlaps with Stefan, even up to the level of using the same slides. Stay tuned. Well, I decided to study industrial design, leaving high school, very broad, generic, interesting study. Also, I discovered at some point I was not really a gifted designer. Some people from my generations made it to the top level of European car industry. Well, I was not that level. But I also discovered I was good in math, yeah? At least compared to my fellow students from industrial design, so, okay. I became very interested in that. In my second year, I had a course in linear algebra, and I think I was a real exception. I was totally fascinated by that, yeah? Why? Well, it gives you a lot of space. Yeah, I always thought you have 3, maybe 4 dimensions. Suddenly, yeah, you're free to choose how many dimensions you want. So, important event happened during my second year. We had a course called Vormstudie, and we had an assignment on shape morphing. I see Stefan recognizing this. Well, I thought, I'm not that creative or artistic. Let's try to do it more pure, a bit more mathematical. So let's start with a cone. Then we take a cube. Now, how to get from a cone to a cube? Let's define something in between. You see, you can parameterize the shape by some parameters, the bottom radius, top radius, the height, the number of faces, of course. And then you have defined a design space. Yeah? Next step is that you can sample this design space and, for instance, sequence of shapes. So this is the pattern. Use a little bit of formal thinking to define your design space. Then you start to sampling the design space. You generate solutions by using computers and 3D printing and algorithms. Oops, this was 78. This was done all manually. And then you look at the results and make next steps. I wrote a report on it, 15 pages with a lot of formulas. I was very proud of that. My supervisor, Willem Muller, yeah, was not impressed. He thought it was very cerebral and visually or with respect to shape not that fascinating. And at that point, I started to wonder maybe I should have studied mathematics or physics. Fortunately, later on I found my real niche. This snapshot from a sidetrack from my master's project, using computer graphics to visualize 3D simulations. I developed a hidden line software for that. And then Eric Janssen offered me opportunity to go into computer graphics using raster graphics. And I could take revenge on all those drawing teachers and make pictures without wiggly lines and so on. And finally, that led to my thesis. Since '88, I work in data visualization, first for 10 years at ASEAN, and since '98 at TUI. Well, very, very short introduction on data visualization. You have people that produce and collect data, all of us, and people want to get insight, and the simple answer of visualization is let's make a picture of that. That's easier to understand. And classic example is Anscombe's quartet. 4 simple data sets, each consisting of 11 pairs of values. If you look at the raw data, you can look forever to make sense of that. Try to figure out, for instance, are they all the same, samples from the same populations or not? You can apply statistics, and then you can conclude there must be exactly the same because the averages are the same, the standard deviations are the same, correlation is the same. But when you make a picture, then without thinking, just by looking at the pattern, you immediately see that they're definitely very different. Okay, this was a toy example. It becomes interesting when the data is big and messy, and then we try to develop representations that express the data, and also interaction plays a very important role here. Fascinating part of data visualization, maybe just like industrial design, is that it's highly multidisciplinary. There's computer science, there's perception, there's room for creativity. You see, for instance, 2 visualizations of a hard disk. And there's a lot of space for design. Yeah? I spent hours and hours, days sitting next to my students, playing with the prototypes, trying to see how it works, what can be improved, how can we address the problems of the customer, etc. And more I'm convinced that data visualization is all about design. And that reflects in my teaching. I'll show you some slides that I present in my courses, and you will see that I have roots from Delft. Yeah, Rosenberg and Eekels, yes. Everything influences each other. Things are iterative and cyclic. You do spiral design. Yeah, I assume you're an expert audience, so you know all this. I teach a little bit about graphic design. I try to debunk it a little bit. It's all about practicing. It's about readability. And you have to be very critical and rational. And I emphasize, there's a lot of expertise. So, ta-ta. Learn from Dieter Rams, the 10 principles of good design. I sort of rediscovered them a couple of years ago, and I was really in shock. That's really a one-on-one match with a lot of things we are doing in visualization. Well, that influence carries over to a lot of people in visualization. Typical exponent is Edward Tufte. Yeah? More is less, above all else, show the data. Typical example is, you can very easily create a picture like this with Excel, but it's a much better idea to get rid of all the crap and things you don't need, so that the focus is just on the data. And anyhow, what you do, try to avoid Chartjunk with 3D pie chart as real. Okay. Good. So this is what I tell my students: be critical, conscious, learn the rules, and aim at communicating and making your message clear. And then make something beautiful in the sense of readable, interesting, and inviting. Yeah? So less is more is the key word. And also, aesthetics is not something to aim for. No, it's a result. If you do the right things in the sense of functionality, then it will be aesthetic pleasing. Okay, this is my official part. I also have a dark side, my hobby projects, and then things are different. You know, playing around with math and algorithms. Here you see, for instance, a cipher surface. Okay, I have no time to explain what it is, but the yellow tube you see is a knot, and the surface is orientable surface that has this knot as a boundary. This is something called a regular map. Think about it as a sort of generalization of a cube. The structure of a cube is very symmetric. At each vertex, 3 edges meet, and you can move it around, it will be the same. Now, suppose that you have a more complex surface with holes in it, then you can define similar patterns. And true highlight here was this one. It's known as the Macbeth surface or the genus 7 Hurwitz group. And here's a different version. Okay, to talk about the meaning of aesthetics in all this, I have taken one case, which is quite dear to me, about one particular very classic visualization problem. It's about how to make a map of the world. Yeah? People have worked on this for centuries, and hundreds of solutions exist. Now, what's the problem? The best way to map the world is to use a globe. You know, the three-dimensional sphere. Then you have very little distortion. Look at all the red circles. Imagine the real object, then you can imagine that all those circles can have the same shape and also the same size. Well, if you now flatten this globe, you end up with problems. You see that near the poles, those circles start to distort, different area, different shape. You can compensate for the area distortion, like I've done here, but then you see that, for instance, Northern Europe get shrunk very much. There are different ways to attack that. You can also keep the shape the same everywhere, like in this Mercator projection, but then Greenland is suddenly ridiculously big. So the problem is you have a curved surface, and if you make it flat, you have area distortion or shape distortion or both. Now, can we do better? Yes, we can. Cliffhanger. And of course, you have to cheat to do that, but okay, never mind. Let's have a look at globes again. People that make a globe have exactly the same problem. They start with something flat, and they have to put it on a curved surface. So this is what they do. They use something called a Gore map. This was 8 cores, 16, 64. Well, you see that there's almost no distortion, and all those circles are the same size. Of course, you have a lot of cuts or interrupts, as they're called in the jargon, but who cares? Yeah? This idea of using interrupts has been used before. You see good homologous projection. Buckminster Fuller has worked on this. Well, I wanted to generalize. What's the pattern behind this? What's the design space? What if we allow many interrupts? What choices can we make? How can we control these? I introduced something we called the Myriahedron. Tetrahedron has 4 faces, octahedron has 8. Myriahedron has myriads of faces. So the first thing you have to do is define a mesh on your sphere, and then you get your Myriahedron. You have to decide which of the edges are cuts and which are folds, and then you unfold the shape, and it gives you a picture like this. Now, concerning the question where to cut, I thought it would be good to have some computer science mathematics here, also in this symposium. The vertices and edges, they form a graph, and you have to label those edges as cut or fold. Now, there are 2 rules. Around the vertex, you must have at least 1 cut, otherwise you cannot flatten it. And it's not allowed to have cuts that are in a cycle, because then your shape falls apart. Well, here you see one possible solution. The nice thing here is that this is very well known in computer science, mathematics. This is something called a spanning tree. And there are algorithms off the shelf you can use to generate these. Now you want to have more control. So on a higher level, you want to say, okay, in this area, I want to have lots of cuts. In this area, no, let's try to keep things together. And again, nice algorithms exist that teach you how to get the optimum. There are many styles you can use for the mesh, for instance, parallels and meridians. You can start with platonic solids and subdivide these. And also you can use something called an image-driven mesh. Suppose that on the surface you define some function, say light is high, dark is low, and now we try to have the cuts along contours or downhill. Now that seems a bit abstract, but let's make it a bit more concrete. Suppose that you want to avoid cutting through continents, then this is helpful to get the cuts at the right place. That leads to this result, and if you unfold it, this is what you get as shown here. The fun part here is that if you play around with those functions and mappings, you can get very wild different results. Here I try to avoid to cut through the continents. I can also try to avoid cutting through oceans. And then, well, interesting is that it is very hard to distinguish the continents anymore. Now, let's have a look at an animation. Here I cut along parallels and meridians. Interesting is that all those various versions have a sort of counterpart in standard map projections. That was an azimuthal projection, for instance. This one is I like very much, a bit less well known. Here I start to use platonic solids. I moved the map such a way that I try to avoid cutting through continents. You see, for instance, that Africa survives well. Asia is too big. Okay, here we see the image-driven method. By changing the parameters a little bit, you can get many different versions. This is the ocean version. But you can also make maps where you try to keep the oceans and the continents together. And by introducing a little bit of randomness, you get jagged edges like this. Okay, what's the pattern here? We define a design space. We start with a model. Yeah? And next we define a number of parameters. Then it's playtime. You define instances by making specific choices. Automatically you can generate results. And the evaluation, yeah, in this case it's in the eye of the beholder. I think this pattern is powerful and interesting. Trying to abstract from your problem and looking at it from different sides. This is one story I really try to push on my students, especially my PhD students, but I've not really been successful in that. When you develop something, you can use different tools. Yeah? You can try to reason about it, write down a story, how it works. You can make sketches, visuals, etc., or you can use more formal approach, a mathematical approach. I really believe that all these three are very valuable, and if you do the right job, then they strengthen each other, they reinforce each other, and I find it often quite easy to ping-pong from one domain to another. It's not that everything has to be put in formulas or that pictures make you happy and solve everything. No, try to use this combination. Especially if you're stuck in one line of reasoning, try another domain. And now, coming back to aesthetics, when I reflect on what I'm doing in developing stuff like this, I've quite some other examples, but okay. Yeah, I find that aesthetics is a very strong driving guide. Aesthetics in the classic way of Dieter Rams, the less is more, the almost mathematical purity. Try to make things symmetric, elegant, minimalistic, maybe also surprising. And if you apply this, not only on the mathematics, but in all domains, together they form a strong driving force to get clean and interesting results. Okay, well, going back to the beginning, you see that I replaced the question mark with an exclamation mark. I really like the fun you can get by using mathematics, formal approaches, and I think that aesthetics plays an important role in this, but I look forward very much to the lecture of Lou, and I guess that he will have much more to say about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very inspiring talk again. It's a good news that visualization is more about design nowadays, so that gives us more jobs, more work to do from industrial design. Do we have questions from audience? We allow one question because we are running behind time. Emilia?
Sorry,
How do you represent?
We have been hearing about in astronomy they discovered new objects and they even filmed them like...
Sorry, my ears are not very good. They're getting old. Can you speak up a little bit?
Would you be able to represent a black hole?
A black hole? Yeah, I guess it's dark in there. But, yeah, one of the lessons I learned is that human perception and cognition have hard boundaries. Thinking about black holes, but the same holds also for the world of, say, quantum dynamics. It's so totally different from everything we know from our senses that make a direct representation or even think about it in physical things is dangerous and misleading. Of course, it is challenging to make that step, but yeah. Black hole, well, no, I don't know.
Okay. I thought visualization of black hole is very straightforward and easy because nobody can say whatever I do is wrong because nobody has seen it. Let me do some technical switch first. So our next speaker is Marina Tutus. Marina Tutus is an initiator and a driving force behind BuyWire.net. As a teacher, coach, and researcher, she works for a at the fashion department, Utrecht School of the Arts, and also at our department. Marina Tutus.
Well, thank you all for being here. And thank you, Lou, for inviting me to be at this moment at this desk. Yes, this is actually currently my home since almost 2 years. We are working from this space, and I can call Eindhoven my home. Before that, I was working from the Utrecht area on exactly the same thing that we are currently working on, and that is innovating of fashion. Why? Well, I think we see here a car from the 50s, and they totally don't look like that anymore. They're way more protective, they're more energy friendly, and if you have this expensive cars, they even start to drive themselves. I think here this is the icon of innovation and change. Also an exemplar of the 1950s. Well, now they take up over so many more functionalities than they did back then. This one even still had a wire. But then, when we talk about garments, and then I'm talking about the everyday garments, so that's what you and I are currently wearing, are actually being made with exactly the same production technologies as the end of 1800s when Levi started to mass manufacture. They're made out of almost exactly the same kind of materials. Since 1953, when polyester was being widely accepted by the commercial fashion industry. So how come that everything is changing, but the thing that we are wearing, that every morning again we think about, that we spend quite a bit of money on, and a whole lot of thought, is hardly changing. Well, this is what what struck me when I was studying fashion design. And also it frustrated me. So fashion pretends to be super upfront, but then in the product itself, it's actually nothing happening. And then on the other hand, in the Netherlands, we are making a lot of developments that could have been applied into garments, but they are laying there at the shelves of the technical universities or the Philips or TNO or those kind of institutes. How can we manage that these are going to come out of these shelves and really in the everyday, in the retail fashion industry? Well, this is me still in the Utrecht workspace, doing prototyping, showing the world how fashion also could have been, how it could have been behaving, how it could have functioned as well. And I'm going to show you a little bit of the scope that what I do, and then later dive a bit more in the collaboration between me and Lou. So, like really on the one hand, very functional, a product developed together with also Koen van Os, who's here in the audience, for Philips, to treat pain relief via blue light. So my responsibility is on like the usability, on the fit, on have the textile feel. And well, after a few years of development and also marketing, we could run this process once again within a psoriasis device, so much more stronger medical device. But also it's about fitting, about movement, about how textile behaves, how you can hold these kind of heavy, stiff hardware. And then the other side of the scope, it's this one, made for Ilja Visser. Lighting systems integrated into garments to mimic assimilation, to mimic the changes of skin color. So really handicrafted, one-offs, this atelier full of people who are making these pieces. Only like one show, it's really like the haute couture approach. And obviously, it's clear that my role in these kind of projects is totally different. On the one, in like the Philips developments, I'm like totally the designer and like the integrator of these pieces, and here I'm like the technologist, while educating as a fashion designer. So, but these kind of shifting roles, bringing these kind of knowledge together is what I do and what I love most.
Intelligent fashion, containing technology that can measure your health and is still sustainable. My shirt keeps track of my heartbeat and respiration, so I can be more effective. I know there is a lot of technology in there, but I don't feel it. The sensors are seamlessly laminated onto the fabric. It's very comfortable. It's beneficial to wear them on a daily basis because my clothes check my well-being and stress level. The lease and recycle system is a closed loop. I don't have to worry about what to do when the garment is worn out. The technology will be delaminated from the shirt and parts will be recycled. It sounds like a dream of the future, but it's right here and we are wearing it.
So next to the examples that I did as a freelancer, so the first two, I also get sometimes the opportunity to develop my very own projects. So in 2018, I got a European funding to develop this closed-loop smarted leisure fashion collection based on the technology of Hall Center. So based on technology that we developed already before it's printed electronics, we did a lot of work in integration of these pieces in a like mass manufacturing way, washability, like really based on functional aspects. But well, as you saw in the movie, I totally took it from more this femininity kind of approach, from more the fashion principles, but also to move the technology base forward into delaminating the pieces. So not making sure that it's being produced and that it functions, but also that it functions in the end of the life. How can you prepare these kind of things for recycling? And these kind of like super holistic projects is really something that I love to do and that I would love to continue in future. Well, this is it's also a project that relates to that. So when Corona kicked in, we started making face masks because we just had the facilities and I already had experience in face masks before. And we made a personalized product. So we, in 5 days, we managed to come from first prototypes to first sales by like super quickly iterating on a prototype, building a web shop, putting it on the market, and while we had our first sales, also iterating further. So this face mask is quite a focused thing. It has a shape, it has a material. Well, you need a sales channel, and that is kind of the thing. But then now we are asked by the Dutch government to think along about more the sustainable use of face masks. And then you see like the total complexity that is then again behind it, and like how can we then do not only the mask manufacturing, but also the use of it and the cleaning of it and the coming back system and recyclability. How can we intertwine all these things together? And that's done, again, I think represented here by the fit filter. Well, and as we are then anyhow already thinking about cleanability of disposable goods, like face masks, there are so many more disposables being used currently. So can we then also transform or transport maybe this knowledge into isolation gowns? So that was another request from the Dutch government. What you can see here is one of our prototypes of washable gowns that can then also be UVC disinfected. So then a total new kind of expertise area comes into play, where we try to then find our way in always our iterative design approach by prototyping, but then also like with the testing facilities and also with the big players on UVC lighting. So enlarging these kind of projects and also the impact then with that is the process that I'm in. I think this is also a movie.
It was very painful to see my sister suffering, desperate to go home with her newborn, but the baby developed jaundice. 10% of all newborn require treatment in order to avoid neurological or brain damage. There is an easy way to cure this, which is blue light phototherapy. However, the complex care management requires hospitalization. This resides in the fact that bonding as a family is not possible. Billy Home is a company transforming rather invasive clinical care into natural newborn care for babies with jaundice. We develop a wearable device which can be worn in a romper or vest. Therefore, moms can take the baby home and soothe and breastfeed and do natural care as they want to.
So see that? So this was the project that I was just trying to explain over coffee. So of course it's totally in the other side of the scope again. This is totally like a freelance project for me. I'm trying to support this startup company into getting this product as usable, as integratable, as producible, etc. To really help society further by the functionality of garments, by enlarging the functionality of garments. I think that's also what I'm trying to fight for. What Stefan was already saying, like the aesthetics you can deploy for commercial viability, which is fashion, of course, very good at. Maybe that's not a positive aspect of that. Huh? But if they would put the making it nice, aesthetic, seducing you for the better, then you can also make a change in a super short amount of time. And I think this making use of the power of fashion, that we should learn much more about. Into the wider technology field, but also in the recycling, circularity kind of field. Well, I want to bark a little bit with this project that we won. Now over to so 10 years ago, in 2011, I was invited to help in the Wearable Sensors Lab, which is this one. So let's first do a movie. So the Wearable Sensors Lab within the Industrial Design faculty, well, this movie is about 5 years old, I think. It's in desperate need of a new one. So a few of the people who should do that are sitting here. So I'm really looking forward to a new movie of that. But what we do there is like the integration of technology into garments, as you saw in the movie, but also the ecosystems that they come to life. So the services that are needed for that to really integrate this into society. And while working there, Luc came in, and I was puzzling with some pieces, with the heat press, and we started talking about it. And then he said, okay, maybe the pieces can be shaped in a different manner. And actually, well, next time he came by and gave me some puzzle pieces, Escher-like puzzle pieces, and see how the drape was changing and if it was changing. So actually, that is the start of. I thought I had a movie, but let me quickly check. No, not a movie. So you're gonna have to experience that one, Drape Leo Lightman, who is in a hallway in half an hour from now, before or after we're gonna drink the coffee. So we experienced how these puzzle pieces could fit together and have a nice drape while integrating also hardware, in that case OLED. Since then, we did many projects. So almost every year we try to do something for bridges that is already being named, and I will show a few of the examples here and are also being shown in the exhibition setting there. So this is Pied de Pouls. The copper ones are embroidered, or the total thing is embroidered, and the copper ones are conductive. And with a tiny magnet below, you can feel a little tinkling, a little vibration happening on her shoulder and her hip part. So making use of digital fabrication tools to enhance garments is one of the research topics here. It's just gonna be a movie setting this afternoon.
Getting dressed in the morning belongs to one of my most intuitive tasks of the day. It is a moment of empowerment and self-care. However, the struggle with the zipper of my dress can be very exhausting, sometimes leading to a very stressful start of the day. I needed a change, and this change was Cliff. It is made of powerful mechanics that easily slide up and down the slide fastener, zipping and unzipping my clothes effortlessly. With Cliff, all of my time-consuming struggles and fights with zippers have finally gone. Getting dressed has never before been this easy and empowering. This feeling is Cliff.
A project of Mohammed Baharum, one of the PhDs that Lou was guiding, and where I tried to contribute more in a design approach into application area. A project that we run together, or actually that Lou introduced me, is at for the Bartimee Stichting, who is an institute that's working for blind people. In this case, for children, we developed a play mat, and also here Lou helped out in how the sensing works and how the sound can then be activated, how these algorithms should be fine-tuned. And then in our studio, we made all the copies up to a few hours before my second boy was being born. That's another detail. Cellular Autonoma. I think now we're going to hear a little bit of the voice of Lou already, although he's going to talk this afternoon a whole lot. Also one of the projects that is on show in the exhibition.
One of my fascinations is this contemporary design pattern, Pied de Poule. The simplest one is the puppy tooth pattern. It looks like this. I started combining this with cellular automata, studied by Stephen Wolfram in his book, The New Kind of Science. Wolfram believes that physics, and perhaps also real life, can be based on cellular automata. Cellular automata work very local. Your own behavior is depending on the neighbors around you. Like in fashion, you have the bandwagon effect. If everybody is wearing Pied de Poule, you might start wearing Pied de Poule as well. Or the snob effect, the opposite. If everybody is wearing white, you just might start wearing black just to be different.
I know that Lou hates to hear this back because his voice was not at the best at that moment in time of video capturing. And it continues, so it's also, you can find this very specific information via my website or via YouTube as well. So I'm not gonna suffer you for hearing the total movie. And please, again, a shout out to experience the project outside. For us, the last project that we collaborated on, inspired by Corona, but then taking it a very positive approach, very airy, light, colorful, playful. Also to give a message to the world, like, okay, cheer up, and take advantage of the aesthetics in these kind of heavy notions that the pandemic also gives us and shares us. Developed together with SUMA students, Rob Vogels and Mila Burden. And the very last poster, it's a welcome and a thanks. So welcome to see much more of our work during the Dutch Design Week in the Fashion Tech Farm here in Eindhoven. Welcome to see the exhibition outside in half an hour from now. And thank you so much for listening along.
Thank you very much for this nice presentation with a lot of good examples of the integration of technology and fashion. We see a lot of beautiful examples, but I also have a question. This time I will ask my question first. Because Stefan at the beginning, in his presentations, he said that aesthetics seems to be a kind of a right of certain profession or certain area. Like they state that, okay, maybe for mathematicians, this is not what for you to talk about. Aesthetics should belong to, for example, fashion. So how do you reflect on that? Is that aesthetics only belong to fashion, to design, but engineers and mathematicians should stay on what is pure, where maybe aesthetics is out of the topic for them?
No, I think totally not. I think fashion is maybe even abusing aesthetics. While I, on the other hand, also think that aesthetics can bring something to like technologists or the more technical approaches, which of course the two of you also discussed about. And there is a lot to gain, but you cannot move it that far as fashion is doing, because, well, the fast fashion industry is something that we don't want. I hope that I showed a few of the projects that try to bridge those two fields, and no, I'm still not like 100% successful in bringing this message across, but benefiting from aesthetics to go for the better. I think that's always a very good idea.
That's very nice to hear. Stefan, do you have any reflection to respond to that?
Yeah, because I didn't say that aesthetics is only for designers. I think okay. Sorry. No, so I think we should all care about aesthetics. But my point was that I want to develop aesthetics further, and I think that can happen through design, but in collaboration with other disciplines. And I think that what Marina nicely shows. But
also, you said that aesthetics is also exclusive.
Yes.
What do you mean by that? Excluding whom and what?
Often excluding other disciplines, yes. I think aesthetics, but then in a research context, I think is claimed by philosophy or cultural theory. They are the thinkers about aesthetics, while design is doing it. Well, I think we should be researching through design, which means designers, industrial design as a department, I think should develop the research in aesthetics further in collaboration with other disciplines. And in collaboration with society, I think.
Yeah, it struck me quite when you mentioned the two words like everyday aesthetics, and then there was a split in my head, like everyday aesthetics. So I'm not at the everyday aesthetics level yet. I'm more in the exclusiveness of aesthetics, because it's also like the high couture, of the haute couture, the high-end aesthetics, etc. That is, also something that that is a notion of aesthetics that we should move to the everyday, but is far from that at this moment, I think. So
I have very naive kind of thinking about aesthetics. The link between aesthetics and mathematics is the purity, as Jacques said.
Yeah.
About. So, is that mathematics can contribute to aesthetics? Is just about the purity, or there's something more from your experience?
Well, I totally agree that at one moment in time you come to a point that something is like super simple, and maybe the blue touch, maybe it doesn't look like the most aesthetic piece and the most, but we made like over 60 prototypes for that, and we started like super ugly, and then at some moment in time it became a simple, easy looking, not striking the eye, not being upfront, and then it was like this level of simplicity. Also, it could be produced, but still it has this subtle weaving structure into it, that I think then you enter the level of, yes, this might be aesthetical or something. And that's what I really liked in your saying, okay, the simplicity is, then also it gives you a certain kind of aesthetics. And then reflecting back on the globe and then splitting it, and then split it in many lines. And then, as a fashion designer, I think a lot in pattern making. And then I saw myself already behind the sewing machine, all these lines. And I think then you lose kind of the aesthetics. And I see my nights working behind the sewing machine as well. So, of course, there's a contradiction there. While at the moment that it was like these squared things, then there comes a level of simplicity in. Maybe I'm talking like totally meta level for you, but then I totally saw it falling together or something, and I think then yeah, then we can start discussing about aesthetics and fine-tuning it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Marina Tutos. I will do the technical switch first. This time is more challenging because I have to switch from PowerPoint to PDF. Take your seat. Okay. Okay. Next topic will be we will be continuing with the fashion, and this time we will have speaker from Amsterdam, but he was here with us for a couple of years for his PhD. Now he moved to Amsterdam. He is now Professor of Fashion Research and Technology at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Joy.
Thank you, June. I think I'll start in by weighing in on the last question just a little bit, if it's possible, just because of the cover of my inaugural that's up here. I think everybody's a fashion designer. I think we all put on clothes every single day, and in that we are an everyday fashion designer. And there's an aesthetic to that we learn, and some of us get very good at, and some of us intentionally stay very bad at. I met a lot of people in applied mathematics at the computer science department in Aarhus University during my postdoc who described to me how they were intentionally bad at it because computer scientists' ideas should stand for themselves and their clothing shouldn't have to speak it. So I've seen people literally dress down in order to defend their ideas. But as everybody's an everyday designer and everyone's an everyday fashion designer, I think that fashion has something really unique that happens there and that is really important to understand. And that's that everyone may be a fashion designer in the everyday, but they don't have designers standing behind them. In fashion design, 20-year-old white girls have lots of people designing for them while other people don't. And I think that there's something about the aesthetics of interaction and the aesthetics of intelligence where we can design for everyone, and we should, because everyone deserves to be designed for. And so there's something magic about to happen in fashion, I believe, and that's that we're going to start looking at more people as we are designing clothing. So we'll start from there. So it was only 3 weeks ago that Lou was in Amsterdam as I was giving my inaugural address, and it was really a deep pleasure to have him there because we still had COVID rules up in Amsterdam at that moment, and there was only 22 people in the room, and it was amazing to have Lou be there. And I've gone from the reality of the Wearable Senses Lab here, which is a magical and wonderful place, up to Amsterdam where our machines are a little bit bigger and a little bit stronger, but we're doing some of the same kind of work, and I'm very pleased to be taking that there and doing a little bit of the virtual fashion that I know tangibility is big around here, and I appreciate that deeply, but it's been fun to get my hands on some of the virtual platforms as well. And I think Lou would appreciate some of the interactive machine learning, some of the Sailor Autonoma, and the Alembics that we're doing inside of that, because we can't quite bring it to real-world fashion at this point, but we can do it in virtual fashion, and something magic's going to happen there. I'm happy to say that I get to lead a team of some wonderful designers. Some of them are recognizable as they're just finishing up their PhDs here as well. And what I think is really magic about this is that Eindhoven is a place that has accepted fashion designers. Fashion designers, if you read many of the PhD JSIC lists, for example, in design, there's always this debate that rouse up every 2 or 3 years is fashion design an actual form of design? And I'm really proud to be standing here amongst you as a place that did accept fashion design and brought it in and learned something from it. And I have to say I was scared when I was first coming up here. I only knew Pauline, really, in that process. And it was interesting to see a fashion designer in an industrial design program like this. And arriving here, it was really, really great to find Stefan and Oscar and Ron, but most especially the hidden gem of the department, which was Lou. Lou, who was doing his incredibly weird mathematic fashion that took some while to get used to, but when I realized what he was doing, I realized it was pure genius and that something magical was going to happen there. Now, I don't know if anybody recognizes this, but if you've ever been to one of Lou's lessons, this is what you've seen on an actual chalkboard. And in this day of digital presentations and everybody having a PowerPoint presentation, when you go to one of Lou's classes, it's kind of magic to be sitting there and seeing him take up the whiteboard and find a chalkboard underneath it and actually be drawing out what he's talking about mathematically. And when you ask a question, you don't just get a verbal answer, you get a drawing about it. And I used to keep track of which classes Lou was teaching. I didn't have time as a PhD to attend them, but I knew that I could stop by at the end of class and get a quick look at his chalkboard and understood what he'd been talking about with the students that day. And these chalkboards, sometimes they were very conceptual, they were always artistic. Even if you had the most detailed mathematics going on that chalkboard, you'd also see the name of an artist at Bridges or of a mathematical artist who was using that math to do something with it. So you quickly jotted down that name and went and looked up this artist that was doing something incredibly cool with it. And I can't tell you how many of these pictures I have, at least 25, I think, in the end, but they are masterpieces of what Lou was thinking on those days. It's no mistake either that my PhD is bookended with a paper with Lou and Oscar on both sides, starting off with the Soulmaker. It was a soul-making program that used some generative algorithms to create shoe soles, all the way up to designing ultra-personalized product service systems, which also included Svetlana, where we took that idea that we had taught to the students over 3 different years of digital craftsmanship and came up with this whole service system that students could develop by themselves. Wanted to share some of my favorite pictures of Lou since it is his day over the years. What I love about Lou is he's never, ever too scared to wear even the craziest things that one of his students has made. Or in the Soulmaker up there in the upper right. Why did we print in fluorescent yellow in those days? Because the 3D printers weren't used to using soft materials yet, and only one of the few soft materials that would actually print well was fluorescent yellow. Something about the additives in the color. And Lou had no problem putting on this weird pair of brown and fluorescent green shoes and wearing it to the Bridges conference, to the IGS, the International Mathematics Conference, to present the paper there. And it's over the years, I've just seen Lou do so many great things. And there was an expectation with Lou. Lou always expected you to make great stuff. He expected museum quality, and that's just part of his flair that really takes designers who do have an aesthetic nature and encourages us to take it to a level of professionalism and to a level of museum quality that's always there. Now, what many of you who don't know or haven't had class with Lou many times or seen Lou, or taught classes with Lou, is that Lou dresses his lessons. You could always tell what Lou was going to teach that day by looking at what he was wearing. It became magical after 3 or 4 years. You kind of knew which algorithm he was talking about that day by the shirt he was wearing at that time, or what he was up to, much like we find in this picture down here on the right. This was one of our critique days, and you could see that Lou was in deep critiquing mode, ready to tell the students where they could take it to the next level. And something I always deeply appreciated coming out of Florence was that you could always tell what Lou was about to teach. This was even more impressive when you realize the fact that many of the shirts that Lou was wearing, he had tailor-made so that they were specific for that lesson and the theories that he likes to think about. And it's from those that I really started off with this idea that has led to the professorship in Amsterdam. And it's, is data a material? And this is something that you can see in my PhD thesis I struggled with greatly and was trying to come to an answer to, and I think it's starting to take shape here as we start to look at data as its in its materiality. So I use the work of Michael Weiberg, who has this idea about materiality, and materiality being this idea of wholeness that comes to the composition and meaning of the texture, details, and materials that come together. And one of the questions I like to ask my fashion students is what material is this? And the answer is usually satin. And if you have some more intelligent students in the class, you'll ask them, is satin a material? And the more intelligent students will realize, no, satin is not a material. So the answer is no, satin is actually a weave that is formed by jumping usually 6 or 7 different sheds to come to something that leaves a very, very shiny material. It can be made with silk, it can be made with rayon, it can be made with many different things, but it always results in something very shiny. And I've used this example for a few years in asking, is it a material? And saying, oh no, it's not a material, it's a woven, it's a structure. When I began to realize that maybe it is a material. If we look at fashion, this is a Jill Sanders sweater. What you're going to see is that she's putting together so many different kinds of materials. And if you open up your shirt or your pants and you actually look at the label that's in there, you're going to see that they are blended together with so many different materials now. And as Marina just said, it's usually polyester in one shape or kind. It just has a brand new name on it, and she's right. Fashion has changed very little since 1952. But if we start to think about fashion and data in a sense, satin is just the mixture of some other material with data. There's the properties and characteristics of the data that are expressing themselves out in the material. And it's somehow that combination, that blending of data with other materials that allows us to say that data in itself has at least a materiality if it is not a material in and of its own. And that's no mistake. If we look at the weaving looms here in Tilburg, we will find very quickly that we have tactility and programming going into every single thing that's made off of these kind of looms. The Jacquard loom offered the ability to bring data and material together to make different kinds of textiles, to make textiles that had a print, textiles that had a flair to them. And I love the picture on the left just because of its tactility. You're seeing a very manual approach to it, and then you're seeing the data cards. And these are things that we know in interaction design because these are things we study in the interaction styles. We study these deeply. How are we interacting with them? Where are we touching it? And what is that causing to happen? Yet fashion is in a weird place. Fashion is in a weird moment. I think this is where fashion is at right now. If we know the culture of the Amish is a religious culture that has decided to allow and disallow certain technologies. And that's what I love about this picture, is they're really pushing the limits as to the technologies that she can use here. The Amish will not use bikes, but step bikes are just fine. The Amish will not use electricity, and yet if you look at her back tire, you'll see that she has LED lights on there for riding at night, because they are allowed to have the visible symbols on the back of their trucks and trailers. Their dress is very simple, it's very clean, it's very clear cut, it's very traditional, and yet if you look at the bag that she has in the front of her bike, she has something awesome going on there, and who knows what it actually is. But fashion is in this moment where it accepts certain technologies and it rejects others, and it tends to still look very traditional while it's really trying to strive to be something new. And if we pull back the curtain and we look at what's happening in fashion manufacturing and fashion production, it looks a lot like this. We're using machines and techniques from hundreds of years ago, and yet we're still coming up with the same things that we were wearing in that time period. Now for me, this is ironic and strange because we live in a crazy moment. Online bookstores now have their own space programs. They are literally launching people into space, and all they used to do was sell books 20 years later. So why is fashion left behind in this? Why are we still making clothes like the 1950s, as Marina would say? Well, we used to have a space program in fashion. We used to do all the space clothing that would get us there. Things like Velcro were invented in this period. And it's time for us to go back there and take a look at what was happening when we were making Velcro for spacesuits and start to ask ourselves, what can that tell the clothes that we're making today? That brings me to form language. And I think that there's some real experts in the room here about form language. And I'm very, very happy that Eindhoven is such a strong place for that. Form language tells us how things should be put together. A form tells us how we should touch them. A form tells us how we should interact with them, what we should do in them, and who we should be doing it with. In fashion, we have a really interesting interaction with form language because we take the form language of our bodies, we put it together with the form language of the designer, of their thoughts and concepts, and we do things in it. We interact in it. We go walking around in it. And all that time, we're making things with data, and we're creating data. We're just not capturing it very well, much like Jaak was showing. I'm wondering about personalized shopping a lot these days, because we have everything we need in order to make clothing far differently. If we look at the Nike store right here, we scroll through hundreds of pairs of shoes while we're picking out a single pair these days. We can see all kinds of different options. Nike has a program in the Air Max where they can do customized and personalized shoes for you and help you design them. So my big question is, why are we not tying this to data yet? Why can we not take this beauty of data and the aesthetics of data that Lou has shown us to be so beautiful, and probably will show us again in a minute, and start to do things that are really generated? This is obviously a fictitious brand called Victoria, but what does it mean to start looking at our data sources, and on each one of those data sources, start to ask ourselves, what is the data that's being used to generate each one of these? Why can we not be measuring people individually and producing clothes for them? Why can't we generate that website live? We can still see the selection of clothing that's presented in front of us. And at the same time, it can be showing us the data sources that it's using to generate those things. We've reached a level of photorealism. And there's a great company here in Eindhoven called Patterns.ai, which is led by another PhD from this program, Jelle Sinistra, that has really shown that they can generate fashion on the fly in the live. And that's leaving us in this interesting moment where we can start to generate clothing for the person individually in real time. I've been doing just a little bit of this since I've been up in Amsterdam for the last few years. Our biggest problem we've begun to realize is this: when we turn it on in the AI department, we somehow blow through 50,000 euros in about one day. So it's possible, it's very expensive at this point, but there has to be a way to bring that down. Now there's something really interesting that I think that is also important in this age. We've come to a point with algorithms and our understanding of algorithms that we can show people their data. There's this explainable AI that allows us to really say, okay, I'm using your Instagram data to understand what colors you've worn over the past 5 years. I can use the ResNet 50 algorithm to understand exactly which clothes you've been wearing, and I can tell you, based upon which clothes, what I keyed in on as an algorithm. So what we're seeing in this image is the possibility of actually looking at everyone's clothing, understanding what they like to wear, understand who they socially interact with, and start to generate that clothing directly to them. And I think there's something really magical that happens in that, because fashion is not only a choice of psychology and how you present yourself, but who you interact with and how you interact with them. What I really believe needs to happen, and thanks to Lou, I was able to make one of these, is a compiler of things. We've gotten past the point where we simply have to draw our clothing and hand it off to a developer to have that developer interpret it. Thankfully, in working with Lou in the Soulmaker project, we were able to show that an algorithm could design a pair of shoes and could personalize that designed pair of shoes for somebody. We were able to make a thing with data, but we were also able to mechanically make data from that thing so that we could inform the next pair of shoes and the next pair of shoes after that. So I think what we need to do is look back to the 1970s silicon compilers when we were thinking about logic, and we came up with the languages that would allow us to create silicon and make that, or turn that logic into silicon. And we need to somehow turn that back to actual things in our daily lives. How can we make shoes and clothing that are based upon the logic being compiled? And then how can we present it to somebody in a large website with lots of options so we can control it and understand what they want to do with it and how they want to work with it? That's left me with three ideas that I think are really interesting, and these ideas come directly from Lou and Stefan and Oscar and working in the Wearable Senses Lab, and I find these really interesting. First, we have to accept that fashion is any technology that envelops the body. We have to accept the fact that when we wear our Apple Watches, that we've just enveloped the body in data, and that we can use that data to make very cool things, like the shoes here, and we can do it in all kinds of different materials. I really love the quote by Marc Jacobs of clothes mean nothing until someone lives in them, because it really means that we have to start looking at fashion as it's being used as well. Fashion loves to stop considering fashion the moment it's sold, the moment that it's moved out the door, as we start moving on to the next collection and the next season. But I think as we start to watch people use things and wear things, we really begin to see something magic happen there as well, where we can understand how they're wearing it and what they're doing in it. And we don't have to just sit there on the street and watch them as they walk by, but we can actually track individual people and use some interesting GDPR techniques to really follow those people and make things better for them. I think it's really interesting if we start to consider that fashion is made and worn with data as a material. If we can start to understand that the way that we form textiles and the way that we make textiles uses data as a material, it allows us to do new and interesting things with that material and make clothing that is new and different. It allows us to engage in the cycle of co-design, co-manufacturing, co-use, and co-analysis. And that allows us to reach out to friends in mathematics and in computer science and in industrial design and bring them into our process with us and work together to make something that looks new and looks different and behaves far different than anything has before. Finally, fashion is the craftsmanship of wearing clothes. If craftsmanship embodies the embodied practice of the craftsperson, that's a hard statement to pull apart. We can think of every day that when we put on our clothing, we are actually just developing a craftsmanship of dressing. We develop style, we develop personality inside of that, and we express it for ourselves. There's a craftsmanship to what everyone does in their everyday. And if we can look at that and observe that, we can help them get dressed and we can help them do even bigger and better things and express what they truly want to express for everyone across the board. So I really hope to have this here today, but long COVID and COVID happening in many of my labs up there, up in Amsterdam, has inhibited having this here today, but we'll have it for Lou very soon. So we took the cellular automaton for a pied de poule, houndstooth paper of Lou, and we've been interpreting that into knitwear. Using computational knitwear, we have had the opportunity to say, okay, this is what it looks like here, and what are all the changes we have to do to that pied de poule to turn it into a sweater. It's been a very challenging process along the way. Translating these things from one means to another in fashion is never an easy process. But what you can see here is that we're slowly but surely getting a sweater that Lou will eventually be able to wear, hopefully here within the next few weeks. And it's taking these ideas of cellular autonoma and moving them throughout fashion becomes really interesting. This is far different than the woven that you can see made by Marina and Lou in the exhibition that we'll go see here in just a minute. And it's that quality that we can express as we translate things throughout fashion that opens up all new kinds of ways of using data as a material for fashion. With that, I'd just like to announce that we are opening up the Wearable Data Studio based upon everything that I learned from all of you here in the Wearable Senses Lab. And it's something that I hope to carry forward the ideas I learned here as we move it out into fashion by working with fashion designers directly there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. I thought fashion for you was only about shoes, but last slides tell that different story. So I will first this time allow a question from the audience. I will keep another chance for myself, but I will first allow the question from the audience. Any questions? If you don't take your opportunity, I will take mine. Okay, I'll take mine. You said data is a material for fashion. We make use of data, and data is usually collected from our daily life or basically from the past. I know when these AI systems, intelligence systems, try to recommend something, make something for me based on what I have from the past, not what make me thinking about the YouTube videos that I'm watching online. So I watch this video and watch that video, and after some time I only watch that kind of video. That's not fashion anymore. It's not fashionable anymore because fashion is about trend. It's about the future. And how do we use data for the future?
I think it's a really interesting question. We've built a few fashion AIs already up in Amsterdam, and what's really interesting is, yes, AI is great at telling us, based upon what you're wearing now, what would you continue wearing? But it's that prediction level of what happens next that I think is really fascinating. Discovering and using or looking at the AI data sets that we've been creating, what happens there is that the fashion that's in trend can be very much knowable. And we can tell what's happening now and we can keep in trend. It's that emergent fashion, that thing that's happening next, that's going to be the next thing that's really hard to find. There's kind of an uncanny valley there in terms of understanding if it's good or not. And what I think is really interesting about it is that we can tell people who are very unfashionable and people who are very on the wings of fashion actually fall into the same category. And we're trying to understand and differentiate now between those two groups, because you can actually see those two groups coming out of the data, that there's somebody who's really not into fashion and somebody who's 2 steps ahead of where the fashion trend is now, actually show up as the same person in the data. And so I have a team of students trying to differentiate that this semester.
Yeah, so the time is actually also a factor.
Timing is a huge factor. And it's really interesting because there's several AI databases that evaluate style, but they don't take time into consideration, nor location. Because I can tell you that the same thing that is chic in Rome is not the same thing that is chic in Amsterdam. And so trying to understand location and temporality is really interesting. I think Oscar and I have been trying to confront that through this idea of localization and distributedness. And I think that there's some deep, deep need for your help as a technical university there.
Okay, maybe last question is not about content, but more about politics. So you have this new lab which has more powerful machines there. You call it wearable lab, wearable fashion lab.
Wearable data studio.
Wearable data studio. We have wearable sensors lab here, and you're going to outperform us. So my question is that other way around. So what's your suggestion for us to do so that you will not be able to outperform us?
Well, I love this idea that AI has become a design question. And that's where I was very specific between the lab and the studio there. I really see what you're doing in the work of Lou and the work of everyone here as the laboratory. And in the studio, our idea is to take it and try to apply it, try to make it beautiful, and try to bring it into the fashion that currently exists. So I would call us TRL 456 to your 123.
And then we'll have different strengths.
Indeed, and there's a chance to work together.
Yeah, we're going to look forward for the future collaborations.
Indeed, and we're looking at the society readiness levels too, because there are many wonderful things, especially in Lou's work, that it's going to take society a decade or two to get ready for.
Okay, thank you very much. That concludes your speech, Professor Troy Nachtgaal. Then it brings us to the end of this symposium. Thank you very much for staying with us, and also for speakers for very interesting and inspiring talks. After this, we are going to start at 4 o'clock sharp here to listen to Professor Lufeis for his valedictory speech. So be reminded to be back to this place at 4 o'clock. After this and before the valedictory lecture, we are going to have coffees, and we can also visit the exhibition at the corridor from Auditorium towards Atlas. There's a bridge, and there we have an exhibition there. You can visit there. There's also Heroes Like You exhibition at the ground floor of Atlas. Take your coffee and walk around. Thank you very much for staying with us for this symposium. See you later at 4 o'clock.